So this particular piece is looking at the economic motivations of migrants from the Northern Triangle, and we started in January of last year, and we finished just a few months ago. So let me cover it. And slide 2, please. So the problem that we were looking at was, what are the characteristics and motivations of migrants from the Northern Triangle? As you all know, this has been in the news a lot, but there's a lot of complexity to the issue of why they're coming and what people are coming. And the other correlate to that is the question that was put to us as, now what happens if somehow or another with USAID or other developments, there would be economic improvements in the Northern Triangle? Would that reduce the intention to migrate? So those are the two problems, and the objectives are below. Estimate the characteristics associated with migration, socioeconomics in particular, income and conditions. Determine the factors influencing the intention to migrate. Develop a tool to predict intention to migrate. We used a regression analysis to fit intention to migrate, which comes from a survey, to a number of variables, and then forecasted what might happen in the future if the conditions would change, the economic conditions in particular. Then, in addition to that, we conducted case studies of the reduction of migrant flows from Mexico and Puerto Rico. As most of you know, the migrant flows from both countries have, well, Puerto Rico is a state, is part of the United States. But for Mexico, has ceased tremendously in the past few years, and we wanted to understand what was going on there that would explain, maybe as an analogy, what might be happening in the Triangle in the future. And then, of course, the bottom line is to provide insights at a high level for U.S. immigration policy. Next slide, please. So we did a lot of different pieces. The most important part perhaps is the analysis of existing surveys and data. Brian will talk about that. And we used two data sets, the MIF survey data from 2009 and 2019, and the LA POP data from 2004. I think it actually goes to 2019, to which we added crime and economic data to do our analyses. Those are not simply pick up data from a website. It took some work to actually make the data set available and useful for our various types of analyses. On the LA POP data, we used a regression analysis to predict intention to migrate as a dependent variable based on primarily crime in the Triangle countries, economics, and socio-democratic variables. Based on that, Jonathan Iyer developed a prediction tool, which is built into R, the software R, it's called a Shiny app, to predict what would happen in the future if the coefficients of the independent variables would change, especially economics and crime. And then we looked at case studies from Puerto Rico and Mexico and beyond. So next slide, please. I have something. Oh, there we go. No, I got a little window here at the bottom of my picture. I don't know if you see that. Okay, I'm going to give you the big overview of findings and accomplishments, and then Brian and Jonathan will follow up to give you more detail about most of those. In terms of overall migration from the Northern Triangle, I don't know who in the room or at the meeting here remembers the big waves of the Mexican immigration, and both legal and illegal. And in the big scheme of things, it seems to us that the Northern Triangle is a relatively small contribution. However, recently, it consisted of a very particular population, of course, the primarily illegals and asylum seekers, considering family units and unaccompanied minors. The migrant characteristics which come from the surveys are roughly 30 years of age, mostly male, more years of education. We have an interesting slide later that shows that at the low end of education, intention to migrate is fairly low. At the middle range of education, it goes up. And then at the high end of education, which I assume is correlated with income as well, it goes down again. And then another important impact of or factor that is crucial in understanding migration from the Northern Triangle is whether or not people who migrate have family and friends already in the US. And so the factors that influence motivation to migrate are primarily economic opportunity, crime at home, and connection to family and friends in the US. Still have this little thingy here. I don't know how to, anyway, I can't get rid of it. Next slide, please. A few more findings. Now, this is a bit, I would say, disappointing, at least from the analysis that we conducted, that the impact of improvements in conditions in the Northern Triangle are relatively small, based on the regression analysis and future casting on it, using it. So, you will see later that we changed in the forecasting, the Shiny App forecasting analysis, most of the variables to economically favorable in the future, and it still had a relatively minor impact on intention to migrate, and similarly with crime. So this is something that I think is very important from a policy perspective, because we just cannot assume that throwing money at the problem or for somehow reducing crime will suddenly lead to a cessation of the migration. In terms of the case studies, the Mexican cessation of, or rather reduction of migration is primarily due to the demographic changes and the fall of fertility rates. In Puerto Rico, it's different. It's a large-scale federal support, which essentially provided incentives to stay in Puerto Rico. Brian will talk about later about concerns with the impact of remittance. Much of the economy of the Northern Triangle starts to depend on money flowing back from migrants into the United States back to the Triangle. And this could have a potentially counterproductive effect. And this is another very interesting thought that makes an already complex situation even more complicated. So now I would like to turn it over to Brian. Next slide, please. And Brian will talk about migration data and trends, and then afterwards, I think if Jonathan is there, he can pick up on regression and the prediction tool, and then get back to Brian with the case studies. Brian, I already talked some of the results, but as you talk about the two data sets, you might want to comment on some of the findings in it as well. Again, thanks. Over to you,
Sure,
Brian.
thank you, Detloff. Could we go to the next slide? So one of the two data sets we used is the Latin American Public Opinion Project. This is a survey that has been ongoing since 2004 in most countries of the Western Hemisphere. Nationally representative samples of populations are derived from a census frame, and we use LA pop data for the 3 Northern Triangle countries, and we ultimately had roughly 36,000 complete observations, responses of individuals in those countries. The survey is done biannually every 2 years, and we use the surveys starting more or less at the beginning, 2004, and running through 2019. And there's a question in the survey that asks the person, do they have any intention to migrate, to emigrate from their home country over the next 3 years? And overall, 24% said yes, and 76% said no to this question. This is a question about intention to migrate. Next slide, please. We downloaded, processed, and integrated the data of another survey. This is the EMIF-SUR migrant survey. The EMIF survey is run out of a research institute in Mexico called COLEF, and they've been doing surveys of migrants both in northern Mexico, starting in the 1990s, and then in the 3 Northern Triangle countries, starting in the early 2000s. We've integrated annual data for the EMIF-SUR migrant survey for the period 2009 to 2019. And that survey consists of 310 variables or questions. And at the end of the day, we have about 55,000 useful observations. What we did was we integrated the data of one module of this survey. This is the module returned by US authorities. So what COLEF does is they station their surveyors in airports in Northern Triangle countries. And as flights coming from the US to the airports arrive containing people who have been removed from the US, they try to survey them right in the airports. And what we did was we used this integrated data to evaluate migrant characteristics and how they have changed over the past decade. I would point out it took a lot of work to process this survey because it changed from year to year, and it took a lot of very painstaking work to make sure that everything was in order. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Brian, I think I'll go ahead and take over. So I'm going to talk about the regression analysis component of this. So as Brian mentioned, the LA POP survey is an individual level survey of, and the critical question is intention to migrate over the next 3 years. And there's also other questions that are on that survey. Again, we're thinking at the individual level about a person's economic situation, whether they've experienced crime, whether there's gang activity in their neighborhood, things along those lines, as well as kind of more traditional demographics questions, age, gender, things like that. So we conducted an econometric analysis that linked that binomial, do you intend to migrate in the next 3 years or do you not, to economic and demographic and crime conditions. Next slide, please. So the LA POP individual level data, it reports both the country as well as the province where the individual respondent is based. So we linked that individual level survey response data with government statistics and things along those lines at the country or province level. So think about, instead of the LA POP survey might ask, did you personally experience violence? And then we are linking based on your province. Okay, what's the actual murder rate in your province? So not at the individual level of the respondents. We are applying these same kind of aggregate statistics to everyone who responded to the survey from a particular province or country, and different variables linked at different at either the province or the country. The results were generally consistent with what we would expect, and I'll talk a little bit more about those specifically. And then from there, we used an R Shiny app to put this into simulations where we can do forecasting or future casting based on assumptions about, we have these econometric regressions that tell us, how do we think the probability that a particular person would choose to migrate based on murder rates. And the Shiny app says, what if that murder rate were a little higher or lower? And what if it grew over time or decreased over time? So we get a sense of what changes in these variables would do to the average intention to migrate. Next slide, please. So in addition to those kind of macro statistics at the province or the country level, we also looked at additional individual level responses from the LA POP survey. So critical things there included household income, whether a person had personally experienced crime victimization. And it's important to differentiate these things because, even when we think about on the level of a province, there's going to be a lot of variability across people about whether or not they are the ones who are experiencing these negative conditions. While unemployment rates can be high within a particular province, there's going to be a lot of variation in what life is like based on whether you're a person who's in the unemployed population or not. And again, at these individual level variables, we saw things that were consistent with our expectations. And I'll point out that that's not it's not surprising in a lot of ways that the individual level variables were the things that did the best job, because we're talking about linking. We have an individual saying whether or not they intended to migrate and linking that to that individual's decision, rather than linking things at kind of a province or a country level, where there's just more noise and variance. Next slide, please. So in terms of what drives or what influences the decision about whether or not people say that they intend to migrate in the next 3 years, it's largely these things that were from the LA POP that are those individual level variables that are materially significant. So there's a gender effect, there's an age effect, having a network within the United States, and then there is also a crime effect. So if you as an individual have experienced crime, not necessarily if your region is experiencing crime, but if you personally have been victimized, those are all statistically and economically significant in the point that they're the effects on the decision to migrate are non-trivial. When we think about the economic variables, those are often statistically significant, but the marginal effect of those variables on an intent to migrate are far smaller in magnitude than those kind of individual level things that I mentioned above. Next slide, please. So, we end up with we've got a regression that predicts the probability with which an individual will migrate or not. So what we did in terms of forecasting and being able to understand these relationships with respect to policy implementations is we took those regression results and then we apply, the regression coefficients are weights, and we take those weights and apply it to a different value, right? So if we have somebody in our data set who lives in a place where the unemployment rate is 10%, right? That 10% is multiplied by a coefficient. Let's imagine that 10% is 11% instead, and multiply it by the same coefficient. And the logistic regression framework, it accounts for the nonlinearity and all these things. But what we're constructing here is a way that you can put different values of these key variables in and see what our logistic regression would suggest. And then we have a framework where you can have sliders and you can change multiple variables at once, and it will recalculate fitted values. Next slide, please. So we have two looks in the Shiny app. So the first one here is not forecasted or this is not forecasted. So this is actually the distribution over all of the real people who responded to the LA Pop survey with their true values. So intention to migrate is on the y-axis, the x-axis is years of education. And so this is just a smooth function of, as you increase years of education, what changed in intention to migrate. And so this is entirely letting kind of the data that's in LA Pop speak for itself. I will say that these all have kind of a quadratic shape. That's not a thing that we imposed here. These are smooth, flexible polynomials. They could take on any shape that the data wanted to speak to. So as Detlef mentioned before, one of the interesting things that we see here is that there is, there's curvature to this, where, as years of education increases, you see an increased intent to migrate, but there is a turning point where that starts to see reductions in intent to migrate. And one of the things that could reflect is increased opportunities in one's home country as education increases. The thing that I will say here, right, is this is based on the actual data from the responses. So as you get farther out and more years of education, those standard errors are getting larger because you're getting fewer people who are responding to the LA Pop survey who have those years of education. But the Shiny app provides this kind of look for a handful of the individual level variables that were in the LA Pop. Next slide, please. So the forecasting portion of the Shiny app provides the opportunity to modify key explanatory variables, and these are all things that that we could conceivably imagine a policy response to, right? So there's the demographic things aren't in here. We're not going to be changing people's age and gender and things like that. At the individual level on LA Pop, right, we're not going to be able to change whether they personally were victimized. So we can think about the aggregate murder rate, those kind of macroeconomic variables that we merged back in. So that's what the slider has the opportunity to change here. And in each case, these are growth rates over time. So if you click that annual murder rate percentage change up to 0.1, that's going to say we're going to take the 2019 value. In 2020, we're going to multiply that by 1.01. In 2021, we're going to multiply that value by 1.01 again, right? So it's a growth rate. And then we have projections for each of the three countries about the intention to migrate across those as those variables change. The thing I'd say here, right, you can see the standard errors getting a lot larger as we move into forecasting. That's not surprising, right? So the fact that we have pretty tight standard errors before 2020, that is just saying, we have a standard error around the mean of these historic things, right? Those are not projected out in the same way. So when we move into the world where we're projected rather than just trying to understand what is the average rate of responses, signals get noisier. Next slide, please. So I want to just show you one glimpse at this, and this is as you change. I think this is the per capita GDP growth rate. So you do see reductions in intent to migrate as per capita GDP growth rate increases. It's not huge, right? I'll point to, you can note the y-axis has changed on these two graphs, right? So this is pushing that slope down, but it's not like it's pushing it down to 0.1 or something. It's not this dramatic change. And again, this is something that Detloff mentioned, that the economic variables, especially the ones that are measured at the country or province level that we could imagine policy being in effect to influence, those are relatively small drivers relative to the individual demographic and personal experience things that would be much harder for policy to change. Next slide.
Okay, I think now, thank you very much, Jonathan. Now we're going to turn it back to Brian to talk about the case studies.
Okay, so we did do 2 case studies as well. One case study that we did was of Puerto Rico, which is a part of the United States. It's a commonwealth, and there's no barriers to movement between Puerto Rico and the mainland. And the reason Puerto Rico seemed interesting is because in the late 1940s, Puerto Rico was at an economic level that was very similar to other Latin American countries in the Western Hemisphere. And it experienced very, very rapid economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s. And given that the focus of this study was the potential role of economic development in impacting migration decisions, it struck us as a very interesting case study to see if that economic development had indeed impacted migration decisions. And what we found is that in the 1950s, there was a major emigration from Puerto Rico to the mainland, and about 25% of Puerto Rico's 1950 population emigrated to the US in the 1950s. That actually seems to be the single biggest emigration in the Western Hemisphere as a percentage of initial population. That was followed by a big decline in immigration in the 1960s and the 1970s. And our review of the literature and the studies suggests that rapid development of the Puerto Rican economy surely played a key role in explaining this. However, after the 1960s, economic growth slowed down dramatically. Interestingly, emigration did not resume after that economic growth slowdown. And what we found is that there was a very substantial growth in federal transfers to Puerto Rico. In 1974, Puerto Rico began receiving food stamps, now known as the SNAP program. And because of Puerto Rico's much lower income level to the US and much higher poverty rates, SNAP assistance was very substantial. And there's been other transfer programs as well since then. Even given these incentives to basically support household consumption, and and this mitigates the incentives to migrate for economic reasons, a second emigration has nonetheless taken place in the 2010s. And in percentage terms, it's similar in scale to that of the 1950s. And I think the lesson that comes from this review is that migratory movement, emigration, can resume if income convergence ceases. The Puerto Rican economy, the income level ceased to converge to the US level about 20 years ago. And that set the stage for a subsequent emigration. Next slide, please. The second case study we did is of Mexican migration flows to the US, which were generally very, very large during the period 1970 to 2010. It was, I think, the single largest migratory flow to the US in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. A majority of Mexican migrants entered the US illegally, but this migratory flow collapsed dramatically after 2010. It's really one of the most striking changes in the migratory environment really around the world. And this change has to date been little studied. The potential explanations for the subsidence of this flow include demographic changes in Mexico and the US. This is currently the dominant explanation. Additional explanations are changes in US enforcement policies and change in economic conditions in Mexico. The research to date favors the demographic changes as a dominant explanation, and there is no evidence that improvement in Mexican economic conditions has had any impact on emigration from Mexico. Next slide. We also evaluate evidence on the flow of remittances to the Northern Triangle countries. These are private transfers. They're intra-household transfers. Basically, it's immigrants from the Northern Triangle sending money back home to friends and family. And the International Monetary Fund collects data on remittance flows between countries. And we use that data to do this analysis. The Northern Triangle economies have become very dependent on remittance inflows. For all three countries, these inflows now are about 70 to 80% of the value of exports of these three countries. And there is evidence that these inflows are causing something called Dutch disease. The remittance inflows put pressure on the exchange rate to appreciate. You can think of it as dollars flowing in are being exchanged into the domestic currency, and that's causing the value of the domestic currency relative to the dollar to increase through supply and demand. This appreciation of the exchange rate hurts export growth. And the migration remittance nexus has arguably attained a scale that is actually going to hurt the economic development of these economies. These economies are small. They need to export in order to grow, and real exchange rate appreciation is going to hurt that. Next slide, please. Delof, do you want to take over?
Sure, thank you. Thank you both, Jonathan and Brian, for all this detail and the important insights that we gained. This is just a simple summary of the deliverables. We delivered the data sets, the regression analysis and results. We have access to the Shiny app. Jonathan can probably comment on how to access it, but you can play with it yourself. I played with it many times and enjoyed, although sometimes frustrated about not getting the effects that I wanted to get. And we submitted a draft final report. Based on today and the discussion, we do a revision of the final report. Next slide. Okay, now we come to the last couple of slides, which is insights for public policy. After all of these things that we found has to supposedly go down in making some difference in public policy decisions. Combining what we did in the last year with what we studied the year before with the CBP funding on migration. In terms of understanding multiple motivations to migrate, it's certainly not correct to assume that it's all about crime. I know, or we know, it's a fashionable thing to do among some, but it's not all about crime. Economics matter. And in the previous study, we also determined that family reunions and the ability to connect to family in the United States are an important factor. So those three things, crime, economics, and family networks, all play together. We have deliberately not given this any relative importance because the regression analysis does not technically allow you to make these kind of important statements, but one always has to consider that all three factors are important about the intention to migrate. The second thing, and this is like from this year, obviously you would have hoped that the result would be that economic development will matter and fix things. I don't think we can say this based on what we found. The economic improvements have a moderate effect on intention to migrate. There are also, of course, policy obstacles to improving economic decisions, which we didn't get into. And then Brian pointed out something which certainly I had never thought of, and maybe maybe it's a new thing, maybe it's certainly an important thing, that the remittance flow may cause an economic problem in the triangle. Of course, immigration policies send signals. This is a difficult thing to pin down because I know we have some slides or some data from the last round of studies from the year before that shows that certain policy intervention had effects, but it's hard to determine cause and effect, and regression doesn't really do that for you. The other hard part is that you can have a policy like the Trump policy on reducing migration with sending signals that were, well, I don't want to get into that. It's setting signals that were discouraging migration, let's put it this way. And the Biden policy saying statements and signals that it would be more lenient. These are not direct policy implications to migration. They have to be filtered through perceptions. And perceptions come in many different ways. They come through networks of communication, to chatter, through publications, through media, and they may not be exactly what the policy was or meant to intend. So I think that's an important topic to pursue, how policies translate into perceptions of migrants or potential migrants, and how to make sure that the policy itself is perceived correctly. We have not done that, but it's an interesting insight. Next slide, and I think that's the last one. No, not the last before that. Future research topics. So, everybody, every researcher says more research needs to be done, and we are not different in that regard. I think we would like to continue to study the socioeconomic impacts of Northern Triangle migration to the U.S. We're still puzzled about the drop in migration from Mexico, but also, and Brian pointed this out recently, there seems to be an uptick from Mexico recently. And this may be a new problem. So I think while we would like to understand the downward trend, but we also would like to understand where's the uptick and where does it come from. And then, of course, I mean, you do want to get a tighter link between immigration policies and how they affect migratory flows to the U.S. So that's our story, a year's worth of research. Thank everybody who has supported it, and I hope there are some insights there that will help policymakers at CBP and DHS in general. Thank you.